The valley between Tara and Slane lies dark that night, and it is meant to. Every fire in the kingdom of Meath has been put out. Every hearth from the great houses of the nobles to the smallest cabin of a herdsman stands cold, and will stay cold by the word of the High King himself. It is the eve of the spring festival, the old feast the Druids keep at Tara, and the law for that night has not changed in living memory. No flame may be kindled anywhere in Ireland until the king's own fire blazes first upon the royal hill. To break that law is to invite death. The Druids have told Loeger MacNeill as much, and Loeger, High King of Ireland, seated among his nobles and his poets and his priests on the ancient seat of his fathers, believes them. Across the valley, on the hill of Slane, a small company of foreigners keeps a fire of their own. It is the year 433, by the reckoning the church will one day keep, though no one on that hillside is counting years the way we count them now. What matters to Patrick and the handful of monks and companions gathered with him is not the reckoning of kings, but the reckoning of the church. This is the eve of Easter, the holiest night in the whole turning of the Christian year, the night the new fire is struck from flint and carried into the darkened church to proclaim that Christ has broken the tomb. Patrick has kept this vigil before, in Gaul, under Bishop Germanus, and in the small huts of his own exile years before that. He knows what the fire means. He knows it is not decoration. It is the whole of the gospel compressed into a single flame in a dark field. That light has entered the world, and the world's darkness has not overcome it, and will not. He does not know, or perhaps he knows very well, that the night he has chosen and the night the Druids have chosen fall together this year. The spring festival at Tara and the Christian Pasch have landed, by whatever turning of moon and season, on the very same evening. Two fires are due to be lit in the same darkness, on two hills that can see each other across the same valley, and only one law permits it. Patrick lights his fire anyway. There is no other way to read what he does that night than as a challenge laid down in full knowledge of the cost. He has been in Ireland only a short while at this point in the mission, still finding his feet, still a stranger bishop in a land that worships other gods with old and patient ceremony. He could have waited. He could have kept his Easter quietly, in some corner of Meath where no king's watchman would see the glow of it. He does not. He climbs the hill of Slane with his little company, and when the sun goes down and the whole province falls into that enforced and holy darkness, he strikes the flint himself and calls down whatever comes. What comes first is a wall of light visible for miles. It carries across the valley the way fire does on a still spring night, catching the eye of every watchman on the ramparts of Tara, before the poets have even finished the first verses of the feast. Somewhere on that hill a shout goes up, then another, and then the whole court of the High King, gathered for what should have been an evening of unbroken ceremony, is on its feet and looking west at a fire burning where no fire has any right to burn. The Druids are the first to speak, and what they say to Loeger that night has been carried down through the memory of the Irish Church for 1,500 years, word for word, because it was true in a way the Druids themselves could not have wanted it to be. Look at that fire, they tell the king. It has been lit in defiance of your own decree, on a night when no flame in Ireland was to precede your own. And then the warning, delivered not as a threat, but as something worse, a reading of the omens, spoken with the full weight of men whose whole office was to read such things truly. If that fire is not put out tonight, it will never be put out. It will grow, and it will overpower every fire we have ever lit, and the one who kindled it will overpower us, and our king, and our whole kingdom, and it will burn here forever. I have always found something almost unbearably moving in that sentence, coming from the mouths of men who had every reason to want it false. They were not fools. They had spent their lives reading the turning of the year, the movement of birds, the meaning hidden in smoke and flame, and on this one night, looking at a Christian bishop's paschal fire on a hillside in Meath, they read it exactly right. It would never be put out. It has not been put out yet. But that is knowledge for us, looking back across the centuries with the whole of Irish Christian history laid out behind us like a harvest already brought in. On the hill of Tara that night, nobody yet knows how the story ends. All Loegr knows is that his law has been broken, his authority mocked in the sight of his own court, and that the men who broke it are still up there on the hillside, warming themselves at a fire he did not permit. He calls for his chariots. It is worth pausing on that detail, because it tells you something true about the danger Patrick was actually in, and it is not the danger of a difficult conversation. Loegr MacNeil did not ride out with an escort to ask Patrick politely to explain himself. He rode out as a king whose sovereignty had been publicly defied, with soldiers and druids and the full apparatus of a court that could, if it judged fit, end the life of the man who had lit that fire before the sun rose again. The druids advise him as they go, "Do not let this stranger sit while you stand. Do not rise in his presence. Do not show him any honour at all, because to honour him even by courtesy would be to concede something no king of Ireland could afford to concede on the night of his own festival." Whatever happens on that hillside, Loegr is told, it must not look like submission. And here I want to say something about Patrick himself, because this is where the chapter earns its place at the very front of his story. This is our first real look at the man, not the frightened boy carried off in a raid, not the exile weeping in the cold on a hillside minding another man's sheep, but the bishop, the apostle, standing his ground on a hill within sight of the most powerful court in Ireland, watching a king's chariots come across the valley toward him in the dark. He does not run, he does not send the fire out and beg pardon. Tradition has long held that on some journey very like this one, into danger, toward a king's household that meant him harm, Patrick and his small company prayed the great prayer that has come down to us as the lorica, the deer's cry, binding themselves to Christ before them, Christ behind them, Christ in the heart of every one who thinks of them, Christ in the mouth of every one who speaks to them. Whether that prayer rose from his lips on this exact road or another like it, the spirit of it is the spirit of this whole night. A man walking straight toward a king's anger with nothing around him but the armour of the Trinity and the settled conviction that he had been sent. Because that is really the heart of it. Patrick did not light that fire out of recklessness or out of some appetite for confrontation. He lit it because Easter had come, and Easter does not wait on the calendar of Druids, however old and however honoured. The voice of the Irish had called him back to this island years before. "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, come and walk among us," and a man who has heard that voice, who has given his whole life over to it, does not measure the feast of Christ's resurrection against the risk of a king's displeasure, and decide the resurrection can wait a year. The fire on Slane was not defiance for its own sake. It was simply what a Christian bishop does on the night before Easter. The defiance was Loegr's law, not Patrick's flame. When Patrick is finally brought before the king, whether that meeting happened that same night or the following morning as some tellings hold, the court is arranged in exactly the way the Druids advised. No one rises for him, no courtesy is extended. The whole assembly braced to make plain that this stranger commands nothing here. And it is in the middle of that carefully staged coldness that one of the Druids, a man named in the old accounts as Lochru, loud in his contempt, unwilling even to let the silence do its work, begins to mock the Christian faith openly in front of the king, ridiculing the teaching of the Incarnation and the claims Patrick had come to Ireland to preach. Patrick does not argue with him, he prays, and the old account tells us that the Druid was lifted from the ground before the whole court and dashed down, and did not rise again. I will not pretend to you that this is the kind of scene comfortable to modern ears, trained as we are to expect our miracles gentler and our history more measured. But the men who wrote it down were not writing romance. They were recording what the Irish Church believed had happened at Tara on the night its fire was lit. And what they believed was this: that the power behind Patrick's preaching was not rhetoric and it was not diplomacy, and it was not the accumulated persuasiveness of a clever missionary who had learned the local customs well. It was the same power that had raised Christ from the dead on the very night Patrick's fire was burning. A druid mocked that power to its face, in the presence of the High King of Ireland, and the court that witnessed it never forgot what followed. Loiger does not become a Christian that night. It is important to say that plainly, because the story is often told as though the king fell at Patrick's feet before the fire had even burned down. And that is not what happened, and Patrick's own honesty would not have wanted us to pretend it was. Loiger remained, by every account that has come down to us, a king of the old religion to the end of his days. But something in him bent that night, even if it did not break. He let Patrick live. He let him preach. He let him leave Tara unharmed and go on to kindle other fires in other places. In a kingdom whose high king had just watched his own druids fail before a stranger's god, and had chosen in the end not to finish what his court had begun. And among those who were standing in that assembly, watching all of it, the fire across the valley, the druid struck down, the king's uneasy mercy, was a young man named Urk, a judge or a nobleman of the court, depending on which strand of the story you follow, who did what his king would not. He believed. He knelt before Patrick that day, or soon after, and gave his life to the faith the whole royal household had just watched put to the test and pass it. Urk would go on to be counted among the great converts of that first generation, a man who owed his whole Christian life to one night's fire on a hillside he could see from where he stood. That is the shape of the whole mission, if you want it in miniature. A king who bends but does not break. A druid destroyed by his own contempt. A young man who kneels while everyone around him hesitates. And at the centre of it, not moving, not arguing, not currying favour with anyone in that cold and hostile court. A bishop who lit a fire because it was Easter, and let the consequences find him where he stood. The fire on Slane was never put out, not that night and not since. It burned in Urk and in the generations of Irish men and women who knelt where he knelt in the centuries that followed. It burns still in every paschal flame struck from flint on Holy Saturday, in every church in Ireland and in every Irish parish scattered now across the world. A small, deliberate echo, whether the ones lighting it know it or not, of a bishop on a hillside in Meath who was told the law of the land forbade what he was about to do, and did it anyway, because he had come to Ireland for exactly this, to set something burning that no king, no law, and no darkness would ever again be able to put out. The house at Banavame Tabernier would not have looked like the edge of anything. That is the first thing to understand about the boy who lived there. He was not raised in a frontier hovel, watching for raiders on some wind-scoured cliff. He was raised in comfort, a Roman villa with its outbuildings and its fields. A family was standing, a father who held civic office as a decurion and a diaconal office in the church besides, a grandfather who had been a priest before him. Patricius, as he was called then, was born into the kind of household that has faith the way it has furniture. Present, inherited, unquestioned, and rarely used. We know these details because he tells us himself, decades later, in the trembling opening lines of the Confessio, the one document in which we hear his actual voice rather than the voice of later devotion. I had for my father the deacon Calpurnius, he writes, son of the priest Potitus, who belonged to the village of Banavame Tabernier. He gives us this lineage almost apologetically, the way a man might when he is about to confess that none of it saved him. 2 generations of clergy in his blood. And still, he says plainly, he did not know the true God. That sentence deserves to be sat with, rather than hurried past, because it is the hinge of this whole chapter and in some sense of his whole life. He did not say he was a pagan. He did not say his family lacked faith. He said he did not know God, not truly, not as a living presence, only as a fact attached to his family's respectability. There is a particular kind of unbelief that has nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with distance. It is the unbelief of a boy who has been baptized, catechized, brought to whatever passed for Sunday worship in a crumbling corner of the Roman world, and who has heard the name of Christ spoken so often by people he loves that it has become furniture too, present, inherited, unquestioned, unused. Picture him at 15 or 16, vigorous, a little vain perhaps, the kind of adolescent who is quick to notice when the priests bore him. He tells us later, with the particular honesty of a man who has nothing left to protect, that he and his friends turned away from God, that they did not keep his commandments, that they did not listen to the priests who kept urging their salvation upon them. He does not romanticize himself here. There is no false modesty in the Confessio, and no false shame either, only a plain accounting, decades on, of a boy who had every religious advantage and made nothing of it. He had the Psalms in his ears and Christ nowhere in his heart. That is what comfortable Christianity looks like from the inside, and Patrick is one of the few saints honest enough to describe it without flinching. It is worth pausing on the world that produced a boy like this, because Banavem Tabernier did not exist in isolation. It sat somewhere in Roman Britain. The exact site is lost to us now, argued over by scholars who have proposed Wales and Cumbria and Somerset without settling the matter, and the tradition holds the name as Patrick himself gave it, and lets the geography rest in God's hands rather than ours. What we do know is the world that surrounded such a place in the last years of the 4th century and the first years of the 5th. It was a world coming apart with the slow, half-noticed unravelling of a garment nobody has decided to mend. Rome's legions were being pulled back to defend a crumbling continent. The forts along the coasts and rivers of Britain, once bristling with soldiers, were undermanned or abandoned outright. The great imperial peace that had held for 3 centuries, the peace that let a family like Calpurnius's farm its land and hold its offices and raise its children in unbothered comfort, was thinning at the edges like old cloth held up to the light. Patrick's family would have felt this only distantly, the way people always feel the danger that has not yet reached their own door. Britain was still Britain, the villa still stood, the fields still needed working, and there were coloni and servants enough to work them. There was church business to attend, decurion business to attend, a household to run. If barbarian raids were spoken of at the dinner table, they were spoken of as something that happened to other people, in other places, the way we speak of storms that have struck a neighbouring county and left our own roof dry. Comfort has a way of insisting it will last. It rarely announces its own ending in advance. And Ireland, across the narrow sea, was no empire's concern at all. It had never been conquered by Rome, never absorbed into that vast administrative peace. And so it remained to Roman eyes precisely what unconquered places always seem from within the walls of civilization. Wild, unlettered, dangerous, other. No one in that villa household imagined Ireland as anything but a threat that occasionally sent its ships across the water to take what it wanted and vanish again before help could come. Nobody imagined it as a nation waiting unknowingly for the boy asleep under that roof. That is the first great irony of Patrick's life, and it deserves to be named plainly here at the start. The place his family feared was the place God had already marked out to be the whole shape of his purpose. The sea that would take him was not an accident of geopolitics. It was Providence moving exactly as Providence so often moves, through the very dangers a comfortable household hopes never to meet. We should not make Patricius into a villain of this early chapter, a wicked boy who deserved what came. That would be its own kind of dishonesty. And worse, it would betray what he himself says. He is careful, when he confesses his youthful sins, not to specify some scandalous catalogue of vice. He simply says he did not know God, that he turned away, that he and his companions ignored the priests. This is the ordinary faithlessness of the comfortable, not rebellion so much as inattention. He was a boy of a good family in a church that had, by his own admission, grown a little cold at the root, even while it kept its outward forms. Deacons and priests in the family line, yes, but a living relationship with the God those offices were meant to serve, no, not yet. not until the sea took him. This is worth dwelling on for a reader meeting Patrick for the first time, because it is precisely the point at which so many of us recognize ourselves. Very few of us are raised as pagans who must be persuaded from nothing. Far more of us are raised as Patricius was, with faith present in the house, spoken of at meals, practiced in its outward forms, and never once truly met. We go to Mass because our family goes to Mass. We say prayers we were taught before we could understand them. We know the shape of belief without ever having felt its weight. Patrick's Confessio does not open with the fire. It opens with the ash, with a boy who had every religious advantage the 4th century could offer and used none of it, until the ash was blown apart by something he never asked for and could never have arranged for himself. That something came in the night, out of the sea, the way it so often did along that whole unguarded coast in those years. We do not have Patrick's own description of the raid in dramatic detail. The Confessio is a document of conscience and gratitude, not a chronicle, and he does not linger on the violence for its own sake, but he tells us enough. He was about 16. He was taken from Banavem to Bernier, from his father's estate. Along with a great many others, he says thousands, and even allowing for the rounding of memory and the rhetoric of grief. The scale he describes is not a single kidnapping but a raid, a systematic and brutal harvesting of Roman British lives by Irish ships that had learned exactly where the coast lay undefended and exactly when to come. Try to hold the ordinary shape of that night before it happened. A household settling into evening. Whatever servants and family were about their business, a meal finished perhaps, or the fields secured for the night, animals brought in, the ordinary rhythm of a working estate winding down as it had wound down every evening of this boy's life. No warning bell, no signal fires along that stretch of coast, or none that reached in time. The raiders who came for the people of that district did not come as an army announcing itself. They came the way raiders always come, fast, in the dark, striking before resistance could organize, taking what was valuable and gone again before the alarm could spread inland. Cattle, sometimes, portable wealth, sometimes, and people, young, strong, useful people, exactly the kind of captive who could be marched to a ship and sold in Ireland as a slave, valuable precisely because they were young enough to work for decades and strong enough to survive the journey. Patricius was exactly that kind of captive. 16, healthy, a landowner's son who had likely never done a genuinely hard day's labour in his life, and about to be handed over entirely to people who would not care in the slightest that his father was a decurion of the Roman order or a deacon of the church. All of that status, the 2 generations of clergy, the civic office, the villa and its fields, evaporated in a single night's violence. He was not spared because he was a Christian son. He was not spared because his family had standing. The raiders who took him did not ask what God his household served. They needed hands, and he had 2 of them, and he was young enough that they would not wear out quickly. We should sit for a moment with what this meant, practically, for a boy who had never known real deprivation. He was bound, almost certainly, and marched or carried to a waiting ship along with the others taken that night. Neighbours, perhaps servants from his own household, other children of other comfortable families up and down that stretch of coast. All of them suddenly reduced to the same status, cargo. The ship that carried him across the sea to Ireland carried him away from every certainty he had ever possessed. Away from his father's house and his father's protection. Away from the church that had baptized him and never once, in his own telling, truly reached him. Away from Roman order itself, from the whole vast, fraying, but still recognizable world of law and lineage and inherited comfort that had shaped every day of his life until that night. And into what? Into Ireland, a country his family had only ever feared from a distance, now suddenly the entire and total fact of his existence. Into slavery, the most complete kind, the kind that strips a man not just of freedom but of identity, that turns a decurion son into simply a captive to be sold, valued only for what labour could be gotten out of him. We will follow him into that captivity in the chapter that comes next, into the cold and the hunger and the isolation of the Irish hillside where he would be set to work. But here, at the hinge point itself, it is worth pausing on the theological weight of what had just happened, because Patrick himself insists on it, and we owe him the honesty of taking him at his word. He tells us in the Confessio that this catastrophe was not meaningless. He says plainly that he and his people were carried off deservedly, because they had turned away from God, because they had not kept his commandments, because they had not listened to the priests who reminded them of their salvation. This is not a comfortable thing for a modern reader to hear, and it would be dishonest to soften it into something gentler than what he actually wrote. Patrick does not present his enslavement as random misfortune, a piece of bad luck that happened to fall on an innocent boy. He presents it, looking back across decades, with the clarity that only long hindsight and long prayer can give a man, as the Lord's own discipline, severe, unwelcome, and entirely merciful in what it accomplished. The Lord brought down upon us the fury of his being, he writes, and scattered us among many nations, even to the ends of the earth, where now my littleness is placed among strangers. There is nothing bitter in that sentence when you read it in its full context. It is the language of a man who has come through everything that followed to see even his captivity as a gift disguised as a wound. The precise moment at which a faithless boy in a comfortable house stopped being merely the inheritor of a religion and became, however unwillingly at first, its instrument. He would not have chosen that night. No one would. But he came to understand, and to say so in writing for anyone who would ever read him, that the God he had ignored for 16 years was not going to be ignored forever, and that the sea which took him from Benavent-Tabernier was the very sea across which his whole vocation was waiting to be delivered to him. That is where we leave him now, not yet praying, not yet transformed, just a frightened, exhausted boy on a ship crossing water he had never crossed before, carried toward a country he had been raised to fear, with every comfort of his old life stripped away in a single night and nothing yet in its place. The fire has not been lit, but the wood has just been gathered, against his will and beyond his understanding, and it will not stay unlit for long. Nobody wakes a slave gently. On the mountain called Slemish, in the years that followed his capture, the boy who had once slept late in a warm house in Benavent-Tabernier learned to rise in the black hour before dawn, stiff with cold, and go out to sheep who did not care that he had been free. We do not know exactly how the pirates disposed of him once the ship touched Irish shores, but the tradition that has come down to us, and that Patrick himself never contradicted, gives him to a chieftain named Miliuk, a petty king of the Dalriata in the north of Ireland, a man who needed hands for his flocks and cared nothing for where those hands had come from. Patrick was one commodity among many that year, a captive with a strong back and a soft accent, worth exactly what he could be made to do. He was set to herding sheep, and sometimes swine, on the slopes of that mountain, and there he stayed for 6 years. 6 years is a long time to be 16. It is long enough to grow into a man out on a hillside with no one to see it happen. Patrick would have watched his own hands change, softness worn away, calluses rising where a Roman boy's hands had never needed them. He would have learned Irish, not from a tutor, but from necessity, picking up the tongue the way a man picks up a tool he is forced to use every day until he no longer thinks about using it. He would have learned the mountain itself, where the wind came from, which hollow held snow longest, where a ewe was likely to have wandered when she went missing at dusk. A shepherd's knowledge is not the knowledge of books. It is knowledge earned one cold morning at a time, and no one gives a slave credit for having earned it. The Confessio does not linger on the physical suffering, though it does not hide it either. Patrick tells us in that plain, unadorned Latin of his that he was hungry, that he was cold, that he was often wet through and had nowhere dry to go. He does not dwell on it as complaint. He mentions it almost in passing, the way a man mentions the weather of a memory that has mattered to him for other reasons entirely. What he dwells on, what he returns to, What he clearly wants us to understand above everything else that happened to him on that mountain is what began to happen inside him while his body was suffering those ordinary hardships, because something was happening inside him. And it is worth sitting with how strange that is, how little sense it makes by any ordinary reckoning. Patrick tells us himself that before his capture he had not known the true God, that he had grown up hearing of him, going through the motions his family and his people expected, but that his heart had been elsewhere. He was a careless boy in a Christian household, the son of a deacon and the grandson of a priest, and none of it had touched him. Ireland, of all places, the land of his captors, the place that had stripped him of freedom, of family, of every comfort he had ever known, was where God finally got through to him. Not Britain, with its churches and its bishops and its familiar Latin liturgy. Ireland, on a mountainside, herding another man's sheep. But after I came to Ireland, Patrick writes, I tended sheep every day, and I prayed many times a day. More and more the love of God and fear of him increased in me. And my faith grew, and my spirit was moved, so that in a single day I would pray as many as 100 times, and in the night nearly as many, even when I was staying out in the woods or on the mountain. I would rise for prayer before dawn, in snow, in frost, in rain, and I felt no harm from it, nor was there any sloth in me. As I now realize, it was because the Spirit was fervent within me. Read that again, slowly, the way you would if a friend you trusted said it to you across a table. 100 prayers in a day, nearly 100 more at night, in snow, in frost, in rain. This was not a devout monk in a warm cell reciting an office at fixed hours with a bell to call him. This was a hungry, exhausted, half-frozen slave boy on an open hillside in a foreign land, with no priest to guide him, no book to read from, no community of the faithful to hold him up, and he could not stop praying. Something in him had caught fire, and the fire would not be put out by weather or hunger or the crushing monotony of forced labour. If anything, the labour seemed to feed it. There is nothing quite like the silence of a mountainside before sunrise to teach a man that he is not alone out there after all. Think about what 100 prayers a day actually means in the shape of an ordinary day of shepherding. It means he was praying while he walked, praying while he watched the flock, praying in the brief pauses between one task and the next, the way another man might hum, without noticing he was doing it. It became not an event in his day, but the fabric of his day, so constant, so repeated, that it stopped being something he did and became something he simply was. A path worn into grass does not look like much after the first crossing. It is only after the 100th crossing, the 1000th, that the ground itself remembers the shape of the walking, and holds it even when no one is there. That is what those 6 years did to Patrick. Prayer wore a groove into him, cut by repetition and cold and loneliness and grace, until the groove was so deep that nothing in his later life, not danger, not exhaustion, not the constant threat of death that would follow him across the whole of his mission, could shake him out of it. The habit of praying became, quite simply, who he was. He tells us later in the Confessio that this was not his own doing. He is careful, almost insistent about that point. It was the Spirit within him. He was, in his own words, being shaped by a hand he had not asked for and did not yet fully understand. There is something for us in that, something the Church has never stopped teaching, and that Patrick's own life proves better than any homily could. Grace does not usually arrive with trumpets. It arrives, most often, the way it arrived for him, in repetition, in the unglamorous discipline of showing up to pray when nobody is watching and nothing is happening and the wind is cutting through your clothes. 6 years is not a dramatic conversion story in the way we sometimes want our saints' lives to be dramatic. There is no single blinding moment on that mountain, no voice from heaven splitting the sky over Slemish while the sheep scatter in fright. There is only a boy who kept praying, day after day, year after year, until the boy who had prayed carelessly in Britain and the man who would one day walk fearlessly into pagan Ireland to preach Christ crucified had become, without any single hinge moment to mark the change, the same person. We should not romanticize the loneliness, though. 6 years among people whose language was not his own, whose customs he had not chosen, working for a master who owned him. This was real captivity, real grief, real fear, and Patrick never pretends otherwise. He was cut off from his family, and there is no reason to think word ever reached them of where he was or whether he still lived. He would have known, in the honest way a slave knows these things, that Miliach could sell him again, could work him to death, could do as he liked with him, because that was simply what it meant to be property in that world. And yet it was there, precisely there, in that stripped down and frightening condition, that Patrick says he came to know God, not as an idea inherited from his family, but as a presence he could feel close to him, sustaining him, holding him upright when every circumstance of his life argued that he should be broken. The Lord opened my mind to an awareness of my unbelief, he writes, so that, even so late, I might remember my sins and turn with all my heart to the Lord my God. Even so late. There is a tenderness in those 3 words that should stop us cold. He believed, looking back from old age, that God had been patient with him, that the 6 years on the hillside were not punishment but rescue, mercy disguised as misfortune, a hand reaching into the exact darkness where he had wandered and refusing to let go of him there. The 6th year came, and something in him began to shift again, the way weather shifts before you can name what has changed in the air. He does not tell us the sheep grew fewer, or that Miliach's household grew harsher, or that any outward circumstance altered at all. What changed was interior, and it came to him as so much of the deepest truth in his life came to him in the night. He was asleep, worn out, most likely the way any shepherd would be worn out after a full day on that mountain, when a voice spoke to him. Patrick records it plainly, without embellishment, the way he records everything that mattered most to him. You do well to fast, soon you will depart for your own country. He woke, he tells us, astonished, turning the words over, wondering what they could mean, wondering whether he dared to believe them. A slave does not simply decide one morning to go home. There was no road marked out for him, no map, no ship waiting at the bottom of the mountain. And yet the voice had said it so plainly, so much like an ordinary fact being stated to him, that he could not shake it loose from his mind. Not long after, Patrick does not tell us exactly how long, only that it followed, the voice came again, and this time it was more specific still. Look, it said, your ship is ready. 2 short sentences, no thunder, no vision of angels, nothing that a painter could easily put on a wall. Just a voice in the dark, telling a hungry, exhausted young shepherd that the way home existed and that it was time to find it. We ought to sit with how strange a thing this was to believe. He had never seen this coast the voice seemed to be pointing him toward. He did not know how far it lay, though he would come to learn it was some 200 miles from where he stood, an enormous distance for a man with no money, no protection, and a master who by every right of that pagan society could hunt him down as a runaway and do what he liked with him if he were caught. There was no reasonable calculation that made this venture sound sane. And Patrick does not pretend that he understood it fully himself in that moment. What he tells us, simply, is that he trusted it. Whatever the fire was that had been kindled in him on that mountainside across 6 years of prayer in snow and frost and rain, it was strong enough now to carry him past fear, past the sensible caution of a man who had every reason to stay exactly where he was rather than risk a lash or worse for attempting flight. So he did not wait for the voice to explain itself further. He got up. He left the flock, left the mountain, left the household of the man who had owned him for 6 years of his young life. And he set out walking, alone, toward a coastline he had never seen, and a ship he had only been told, in a dream, was waiting for him. It is worth remembering, as he walked, that this was the same boy who had once thought so little of the God his father and grandfather served that he could barely be bothered to attend to the faith around him. 6 years on a hillside, tending another man's sheep in weather that would have broken a lesser will, had done what no comfortable upbringing in Banavem Tabernia had managed to do. It had taught him to listen. And when the voice came in the night telling him the way home was open, he did not need convincing twice. He simply went, trusting a promise he could not verify, toward a shore he did not know, because somewhere in those 6 years of cold mornings and whispered prayers, he had learned that the God who spoke to him in the dark could be trusted with the daylight too. The voice came to him in a dream, the same way the strength to endure the hillside had come to him, not as thunder, but as a certainty settling into a sleeping man's chest. Well done your fast. That much he understood. He had been keeping a fast, weeks of it, though for what he could not have said. Then, before he woke, came the second word, the one that changed everything. Behold, your ship is ready. He wrote of it plainly in the Confessio, the way he wrote of every grace, without embellishment, as a man reporting a fact he still could not quite believe. The ship was ready, but it was not near. It was, he says, 200 miles away, in a place he had never set foot in, among people he did not know a single soul among. 6 years a slave on an Irish hillside, and now a boy, not yet 22, was being told to walk clean across a country that had only ever shown him the inside of its wilderness, toward a coastline he had never seen, to board a vessel whose name he did not know, captained by strangers who had given him no reason to expect welcome. He went anyway. That is the plain fact of it, and it is worth sitting with, because we are so used to Patrick the Bishop, Patrick the Apostle of Ireland, that we forget this part of the story is simply a young man's escape, the kind that gets told around a fire because it should not have worked. He had no map, he had no money that we know of. He had, by his own account, only this, the conviction that God had spoken, and the strength that God who had spoken now supplied to walk it out. I fled, he writes, from a master I had served for 6 years, and went in the strength of the Lord, who was directing my path to my good. And I feared nothing until I reached this same ship. That is the whole of his own report on the journey. 1 sentence for 200 miles. He does not tell us what he ate along the road, or where he slept, or whether he travelled at night to avoid capture, though a fugitive slave in that country surely must have. He does not tell us how many days it took, though scholars reckon it would have been weeks on foot through unfamiliar terrain. What he tells us instead is what mattered to him, that he was not afraid. A boy who once could not stop shaking on a cold hillside now walked alone across hostile ground and felt no fear at all, because he understood, finally and completely, whose hand was on him. We ought not read past that too quickly. Fear had been his whole boyhood. Fear of his father's expectations, fear of the raiders who came out of the sea, fear of the wolves and the cold and the silence on the hill. And now, at the one moment when fear would have been perfectly reasonable, a runaway slave crossing a strange country with nothing but a dream to guide him, it left him entirely. That is not the courage of a reckless young man. That is the particular steadiness God gives to someone who has spent 6 years learning, prayer by prayer, that he is not alone. The hillside had been the making of that steadiness. The road was where he first got to spend it. He reached the harbour, and there, at last, after the whole improbable walk had gone exactly as the dream had promised, the story took the one turn he had not expected. The ship's captain would not have him. We can only guess what the place looked like. Some Irish port with a Gaulish or British trading vessel drawn up, likely carrying hounds, for Ireland's dogs were prized on the continent, along with hides and whatever else such ships dealt in. Patrick came to the men loading her and asked for passage. It is the kind of moment every emigrant since has known in one form or another, standing before a stranger who holds the only door out, and asking. The captain, Patrick tells us, was angry at the request and answered him sharply. By no means try to go with us. Think of what that refusal must have cost him to hear. He had walked 200 miles, believing this ship, of all ships, was his. God had told him so in a dream. And here at the very threshold, the door was shut in his face by a man who owed him nothing and wanted nothing to do with a ragged Briton who had no coin, and a story about a voice in the night. Patrick turned and walked away, back toward the hut where he had been given some rough lodging while he waited on the shore, he tells us, and as he walked, he began to pray. Not a prayer of complaint, so far as we can tell from how he recounts it, but simply prayer, the same instinct that had carried him through 6 years of hillside nights. When the ground gives way, turn to the one thing that has never moved. He had not even finished the prayer when he heard shouting behind him. One of the crew was calling after him, urgently, "Come quickly, for these men are calling you." The captain had changed his mind, or something in the captain had been changed for him. Patrick turned back, and this time they welcomed him. "Come," they said, "we take you on trust. Make friends with us in whatever way you like." That last phrase is doing more work than it looks like at first reading, because what followed was a pagan gesture of bonding that the sailors expected of him, pressing him to seal the new friendship in the old way of that world, a physical rite of loyalty between men making common cause on a dangerous voyage. Patrick would not do it. He tells us plainly that he refused for fear of God, even as he made every effort to be at peace with them in every other way he could manage, hoping, his word, that they might come to faith in Jesus Christ, for they were pagans. It is a small moment, easy to miss, but it shows us something that will recur across the whole of his life. Patrick could bend a great deal to meet people where they stood, but there was always a line past which no threat and no need would move him. Even starving, even a fugitive, even utterly dependent on these men's goodwill to get him home, he would not cross it. And they, for their part, did not turn him away for the refusal. They took him aboard anyway. And the ship set sail almost at once. Patrick tells us there was wind in the sails within 3 days. He does not linger on the crossing itself. 3 days at sea, and then land, but not, as he'd surely hoped, the shore of home. What came next was worse than the sea, a wilderness. 28 days, he tells us, the company travelled through deserted country, and their food ran out. It is not entirely clear from his account where they had landed. Gaul, most likely, in some region emptied by war or raiding. Land laid waste and unable to feed a party of travellers passing through it. Whatever the cause, 28 days is a long time to walk hungry, and by the end of it the ship's captain, the very man who had refused Patrick passage, turned to him with something between a challenge and a plea. "What do you say, Christian?" the captain asked him. "You tell us that your God is great and all-powerful. Why then can you not pray for us? For we are in danger of starving." There is no better window into who Patrick had already become on that hillside than his answer to that question. He did not hedge. He did not equivocate about whether such a prayer was presumptuous, or wonder aloud whether God concerned himself with the hunger of pagan sailors on a foreign road. He tells us he answered with confidence, urging them to turn with faith and all their heart to the Lord his God, for nothing was impossible to him, that he might send them food for the journey until they were satisfied, for he has abundance everywhere. And Patrick simply reports this as fact, the way he reports every grace in the Confessio, without drama, without a single word wasted on wonder at his own prayer being heard. A herd of swine appeared in the road before them. The company killed many of them, stayed there 2 nights, and recovered their strength on the meat. For, Patrick notes dryly, many of the men had grown faint and were left half dead along the way. Their dogs, too, he tells us, were revived and fed. From that day, he says, they had food in abundance. Some even found wild honey along the road afterward and offered him a share of it, though he would not touch it, because, in a small aside that tells us something of his scruple even in extremity, one of the men had, in the same breath, offered some of it in sacrifice to an idol. We should not rush past that miracle by the roadside either. It is easy, reading it centuries later, to file it under the general category of wonders that happen in saints' lives and move on. But notice what it actually is. A company of hardened, hungry, pagan sailors watching a former slave boy pray out loud for their deliverance, and then watching that deliverance walk out onto the road in the shape of a herd of pigs. Whatever else those men believed, by the time they parted ways from Patrick, they had watched with their own eyes the God of a Christian slave feed them in a wasteland. That is not nothing. Seeds like that do not always sprout where you can see them, but they get planted all the same. Eventually, though Patrick, true to form, gives us no further detail of the road, the border crossings, or however many more days it took, he came home. Home to Banavem Tabernier, to the villa and the farm and the household of Calpornius the deacon, Patitus the priest-grandfather, now surely gone or aged, and a family who had long since given him up. We can imagine what that reunion looked like better than Patrick tells us, because he tells us almost nothing of it directly, only that his parents received him as a son, and that they begged him, urgently and repeatedly, never to leave them again, not after everything. It is worth pausing on that plea, because it is the most human moment in the whole account. And Patrick does not dwell on it, but it must have been enormous. Picture the scene from Calpornius's side of it. A son taken from the family estate by raiders, presumed dead in all but the last stubborn corner of hope. And then, after 6 years of silence, walking back through the gate. Every parent who has ever waited on news of a missing child will know something of what that household felt. And their answer to the miracle of his return was the most natural answer in the world. Never again. Stay. Be safe. Let the rest of your life be lived here, within sight of us, where we can watch over you and never lose you a second time. It would have been the easiest thing in the world for Patrick to agree. He was young still, not yet 25 by most reckonings, with a family of standing, a household that could provide for him, and a story of survival so remarkable that it alone would have made him welcome anywhere in that world for the rest of his days. He had earned, by any ordinary measure, the right to be comfortable. And here is the strange thing, the thing Patrick himself puzzles over in the Confessio without ever fully explaining it. He could not settle. He was home, he was safe, he was loved, and none of it took hold in him the way it should have. Something in those 6 years on the hillside had rearranged him at the root, and the shape he had grown into no longer fit the life waiting for him at Banavem Tabernier. He does not describe restlessness in dramatic terms. There is no account here of arguments with his father, no scene of rebellion. It reads, instead, like something quieter and stranger. A man who has been given back everything he lost, discovering that he no longer wants only what he once wanted. He prayed, still, the way the hillside had taught him, many times a day, he tells us. The habit never left him even in his father's house, where prayer had once been only a formality of Sundays. He kept, in some sense, one foot still on that hill, even while his body sat at his family's table. And somewhere in that unsettled space, between the life he'd been given back and the life the hillside had carved into him, something was gathering that would not let him rest. He does not tell us how long this lasted, months, most likely, perhaps longer. But he tells us plainly enough what it felt like from the inside. A young man restored to everything he'd prayed for during 6 years of exile, sitting in his father's comfortable house, and still, somehow, waiting. The letter house at Banavem Tabernier had grown quiet again by the time Patrick reached his 30s. His father Calpurnius was older now, his hair gone the colour of ash, still holding his office among the town council, still keeping the family's small estate in good order. His mother Conchessa kept the household as she always had. The slaves who worked the land, for the family still had them, as most comfortable Roman British families did, went about their duties in a world that had not much changed on the surface. Patrick had come home from Ireland, half starved and half a stranger, and the household had folded him back in, grateful and relieved, the way a family folds in a son returned from the dead. For a while, that seemed to be enough. It was not enough. He tells us so himself, plainly, in the Confessio, not with bitterness, but with the honesty of a man looking back at a young life he no longer fully recognized as his own. He had come home changed in a way that could not be undone. 6 years on Slemish had taught his knees to bend and his heart to pray without ceasing. And a heart taught that way does not simply forget the lesson because the danger has passed. He had been rescued, yes, pulled from slavery by a providence he never stopped marvelling at, carried across the sea on a ship of pagan sailors who fed him when he had nothing to offer them, walked through a wasted country for nearly a month without starving, though there was no bread to be found in it. He knew whose hand had done all that, and a man who knows whose hand rescued him does not settle easily back into an ordinary life, however comfortable that life might be. So the years that followed were years of waiting, though Patrick himself, living through them, would not have called it waiting. It would have felt, most days, like simply going on, praying, working, growing older, watching his family's hopes for him quietly reassert themselves. Calpurnius wanted a son who would take up the family's position in due course, marry well, hold property, perhaps enter the decurion class as he had, keep the church's business as a comfortable Roman British Christian family kept it, attending, believing, but not consumed. It was not an unreasonable hope. It was the hope any father would have for a son who had already suffered more than his share, and deserved surely to rest now. But Patrick could not rest into that shape. Something in him had been set apart on that hillside, and he could feel it even when he could not name it. He describes in the Confessio a restlessness that never left him, a sense that the God who had found him in slavery was not finished with him yet, though what remained to be done was hidden from him for a long time. He gives us very little of the ordinary texture of these years. No names of teachers, no dates of ordination that satisfy every scholar, no map of the roads he walked in Britain, or across the narrow sea into Gaul, where the wider church was already forming him in ways he would draw on for the rest of his life. What he gives us instead is the shape of a soul under formation, a man being sanded down, prayer by prayer, toward an edge he did not yet know he would need. We know that he was ordained a deacon in these years, and later a priest, the plain, load-bearing steps by which the church made ready a man she did not yet know she was making ready for Ireland. We know that he studied, however imperfectly by his own reckoning. He calls himself, again and again in the Confessio, a rusticus, an unlearned man, uncomfortable with his Latin next to the polished bishops and priests around him, aware always of what he lacked next to men raised from childhood in the schools. It is one of the most moving things about him, this persistent, almost wounded humility, a man who had been given more by God than nearly anyone of his age, and who never once let that gift make him proud of his letters. He knew his letters were poor. He said so himself, without false modesty, because it was true, and because he wanted whatever came after to be understood as God's work and not his own eloquence. And all the while, across the sea, Ireland waited too, though it did not know yet that it was waiting for him. For it was not to Patrick that Rome first turned her attention. In the year 431, Pope Celestine, the same pope who watched with a father's care over the far edges of the Christian world, sent a bishop named Palladius across the water, the first bishop sent expressly to the Irish who already believed in Christ. There were Christians in Ireland by then, pockets of them, likely traders and captives, and their descendants, who had carried the faith over on ships, the way faith so often travels, quietly, in the baggage of ordinary commerce and ordinary suffering, long before any missionary arrives to organize it. Palladius went to shepherd those scattered believers, to give them the structure and sacraments a bishop can give, to plant the church properly where seeds had already, here and there, taken root on their own. It is worth pausing on Palladius, not to linger on him. This is not his story, but because the shape of his mission tells us something true about the shape of Patrick's. Palladius came first. He came with the full authority of Rome behind him, sent by the Pope himself, a man of standing in the church, likely a deacon of some prominence in Gaul before his consecration. And by every account the tradition has kept, his mission in Ireland was short, and it did not take the form anyone in Rome had hoped. Some accounts have him labouring only briefly before leaving for Britain, or dying there not long after. The record is thin, and the Church has never pretended otherwise. What matters for our purposes is simpler than any dispute over dates. The mission that Rome first sent to Ireland was not the mission that would set the country ablaze. God had another servant in mind for that, and he had been preparing him unseen on a hillside in Antrim and in the quiet corridors of the Gallic Church for years already. There is no record that Patrick and Palladius ever met, and the tradition does not ask us to imagine that they did. But it is a humbling thing to hold in the mind that the first bishop sent to Ireland was not the one Ireland would remember, not the one whose name would be carried into 1,000 years of hymns and blessings and children's prayers. God's providence rarely moves in the straight line we would draw for it if we were planning the campaign ourselves. He sends the first labourer, and the first labourer does his part, however briefly, however imperfectly recorded, and then he sends the one who will stay. Patrick himself never wrote a word against Palladius, never claimed precedence, never treated his own calling as a correction of what came before. He simply understood when his own hour came that it had come, and a man who has waited as long as Patrick had does not waste his waiting arguing about who came first. It was not long after Palladius's mission had run its brief course that the vision came. Patrick tells us of it in the Confessio in words so plain and so specific that they have never once, in all the centuries since, sounded like invention. He was in Britain, home by every reasonable account among his family, in the ordinary life that had reassembled itself around him, when in the visions of the night he saw a man coming to him as if from Ireland itself. The man's name was Victoricus, and Patrick tells us he had known him before, though he gives us nothing more than the name, no history of how they had met or what Victoricus had meant to him in the years past. It hardly matters. What matters is what the man was carrying. An innumerable number of letters, so many that Patrick could not have counted them, and Victoricus handed him one of them to read, and Patrick, in the dream, began to read it. At its opening were written the words, "The Voice of the Irish." And as he read that title, in the very moment of reading it, he tells us he seemed to hear the voices of those who lived beside the wood of Foclut, near the western sea, the very region, tradition holds, where he had kept the flocks all those years before, where the rain had fallen on him and never quenched the fire in his heart. And the voices, all together, as if from one mouth, cried out to him, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, come and walk among us once more." There is no passage in the whole of the Confessio that carries more weight than this one, and there is no passage in the whole history of Ireland's faith that has been carried more tenderly, generation after generation, by people who have never read a line of Latin in their lives, but who know, somehow, in their bones, what those words mean. We appeal to you, holy servant boy. Not commander, not conqueror, not even, in that first cry, apostle or bishop. Servant boy, the very words that must have called up, in an instant, every freezing dawn on Slemish, every hour of prayer said with a heart broken open by hunger and cold, every year of a slavery that had, without Patrick ever asking for it, made a servant of God out of a captured Roman boy. Ireland, in the dream, was not calling to the man he had since become, the deacon, the priest, the scholar labouring imperfectly over his Latin in the schools of Gaul. Ireland was calling to the boy on the hillside. Ireland remembered him as he had been when he belonged to her, body and all, and it was that boy she wanted back. Patrick tells us he was overcome. He says he could read no further, that he woke, or nearly woke, undone by what he had heard, and that the voice of the Irish stayed with him, ringing in his heart, long after the vision itself had passed. He does not tell us he understood immediately what it meant. He does not tell us he leapt from his bed with a plan already formed. What he tells us, with the same unflinching honesty that runs through the whole of the Confessio, is that the call landed in him like a stone dropped into still water, and that the water did not settle again for the rest of his life. It is tempting, reading this centuries later with the whole of the patrician story already known to us, to imagine the dream as a kind of divine commissioning ceremony, tidy and complete, after which Patrick simply packed his bags and sailed. The truth the Confessio gives us is less tidy and far more moving. He does not tell us this was the only vision. He speaks, in fact, of more than one such night, of another time when he felt, in prayer, as if someone was praying within him, in words he could not fully understand, and of yet another vision in which he felt he was being addressed directly, told by a voice he took to be the Spirit of God himself, that the one who had laid down his life for Patrick was the very one now speaking within him. These were not separate from each other in Patrick's own understanding. They belonged to a single, ongoing conversation between his soul and the God who had rescued it. A conversation that had been running since the hillside and would not be finished until the day he died. The dream of Victoricus and the letters was the loudest note in that long conversation. But it was not struck in isolation. It was the culmination of everything the years of formation had been quietly preparing him to hear. And what makes it more remarkable still is what it cost him even to consider answering. He was not a young man anymore, free of ties and hungry for adventure. He had a family who loved him and had already grieved him once and did not wish to grieve him again. He had, by his own account, opportunities before him, in the church at home, that many men would have been glad of. A settled, honoured path, free of danger, free of the memory of chains. To go back to Ireland was to go back, quite literally, to the place of his enslavement, to the people who had torn him from his family and worked him half to death on a cold hillside for 6 years of his boyhood. It is one thing to forgive such a people from a safe distance. It is another thing entirely to hear them calling your name and to feel your own heart rising up, unbidden, to answer them. He tells us plainly that others tried to stop him. Church elders in Britain, men whose judgment he respected, raised objections when eventually his intention became known. Some doubting his fitness for so great an office given his admitted lack of learning. Some perhaps simply unwilling to see a man they had come to value sent off to almost certain hardship among a people who had already shown what they were capable of doing to defenceless captives. Patrick does not hide this opposition from us. He includes it in the Confessio precisely because it was real, and precisely because he wanted whoever read his testimony afterward to understand that he had not gone to Ireland on a wave of easy enthusiasm. He went in spite of real doubt, some of it his own, most of it painfully sincere, from men who loved the church and loved him and could not see, as he could see, what God was asking. But the voice would not leave him. That is the plain fact underneath all the years that followed. And it is the fact this chapter has been circling toward from its first line. A man who has heard his own name called across the sea by people who once owned him as property does not go on quietly running an estate in Britain. He tells us himself, near the close of the Confessio, that he could not have imagined refusing, that whatever poverty of learning he carried, whatever fear he might reasonably have felt at the thought of returning, none of it weighed anything at all against what he had heard in that dream and had gone on hearing, in one form or another, ever since. The fire that had been kindled on Slemish, banked through the years of formation, had never gone out. It had only been waiting for the wind that would make it burn. Palladius had gone first, and Palladius's mission had run its brief and quiet course, and Rome, in her wisdom, had not yet finished with Ireland. The letters kept coming, in the only way letters of that kind ever truly come, not on paper, not by any ship's captain's hand, but written on the hearts of a people whose cry had somehow reached all the way to Britain and found the one man alive who could not refuse to hear it. He had been a slave among them once, tending sheep in the rain with nothing to comfort him but prayer. Now they were calling him back, not as a slave, but as a servant of a far greater master. And the boy who had wept on that hillside for the sight of his own country was about to discover that his true country had been waiting for him, all along, on the far side of the sea he thought he had left behind for good. Picture the road, if you can call it a road, a track of beaten earth between raths, running along a ridge to keep out of the bog, with a boy leading a pack mule, and behind him a small file of men in rough wool, singing psalms low under their breath because the light was going, and the next rath was still an hour off. That was the mission most days. Not vision and thunder, walking, a cold supper, a floor to sleep on if a chieftain was kind, a wet field if he wasn't. Patrick himself at the front more often than not, staff in hand, watching the tree line, the way a man watches who has learned, on a hillside long ago, to read weather and danger in the same glance. He was no longer a boy, and no longer alone. Within a few years of that first return to Ireland, the return he had prayed and wept his way toward, the return the voice in his dream had promised him, Patrick had gathered a retinue. Some of the men were Britons he had brought with him, or who had followed after, drawn by the same fire. But more and more, as the years passed, the men walking behind him were Irish, sons of chieftains who had heard him preach and could not walk away, boys given into his care to be raised as clergy, even a few of the very Druids' apprentices whose masters he had confronted and lost to. The mission that began as one man's obedience was becoming, before anyone had quite decided to call it that, a church. The first door that opened to him was a small one, and Patrick never forgot it. Landing on the eastern coast, not far from where he had once been marched ashore in chains, he came to the rath of a chieftain named Dicu. The tradition says Dicu came out armed, meaning to drive off the strangers, and that something in Patrick's bearing, or in the grace working through him, stopped the man's hand before it fell. Dicu listened, Dicu believed, and Dicu gave Patrick a barn, a simple outbuilding at a place called Saul, to use as his first church on Irish soil. It was not much to look at, but it was the first stone, if you can call a barn a stone, in a building that would eventually cover the island. Patrick loved Saul all his life, and asked, tradition holds, to be near it at the end. A man remembers where a door first opened to him. Understand something about the shape of the country Patrick was walking into, because it explains almost everything about how he worked. Ireland in the 5th century was not one kingdom but many, a patchwork of tuatha, small kingdoms, each bound to its king not merely by law but by kinship, by the deep loyalty of clan. A man did not simply choose his religion the way we might choose ours, weighing it privately in his own conscience. He followed his king, because that was the shape of the world he lived in. The king stood for the tribe, spoke for it, and in a real sense carried its fortunes in his own person. Patrick understood this, not as a strategist calculating advantage, but as a missionary reading the actual ground beneath his feet, the actual bonds that held people together. If a king could be won, a people could follow him to the font by the 100. So Patrick went, again and again, straight to the raths of kings. Not because he loved power, God knows. The Confessio shows us a man who trembled at his own unworthiness his whole life, but because he loved souls, and he knew where the doors into a tribe's heart were hung. Some kings received him gently, the way Dicu had. Others made him work for it. At Cashel, in the south, in the kingdom of Munster, Patrick came before a king named Ones, and Ones, moved by what he heard, asked to be baptized there and then. There was no font at hand, so Patrick baptized him with the tools a travelling bishop carried, and in the course of it, driving his crozier into the ground to free his hands, he drove the sharpened base of the staff clean through the king's foot. Ones never made a sound. He knelt through the whole rite, blood running into the ground beneath him, and said nothing, because he believed, the story tells us, that this was simply part of what baptism cost, that pain was the price a man paid to enter the faith, and he would not be found wanting in a Christian king's first test. Only after did Patrick see what had happened and grieve over it, and ask why, in God's name, the man had said nothing. And Oengus, they say, only shrugged, as if it were obvious. He thought it was meant. There is something almost comic in it, and something that isn't comic at all. A pagan king's raw, wordless willingness to suffer for a faith he barely understood yet, out of sheer respect for what he sensed moving through the stranger in front of him. Patrick carried stories like that with him. They told him what kind of soil he was sowing in. Not every king bent so easily, and not every contest was won with blood quietly born. At Tara, the seat of the High King, Patrick met his match in two druids of Laugar's court, Lochru and Lucet Mal, men whose whole standing rested on the old gods and the old fires and the fear that kept the tribes obedient to unseen powers. They would not simply step aside. Muirchew's account of that meeting, carried in the tradition ever since, tells of contests fit to make a listener's hair stand. Darkness called down and answered with light. A cloak cast into a blazing house that the druid's man could not survive, and Patrick's own boy walked out of unharmed. A book thrown into water that would not sink and would not spoil. Whatever the exact shape of what passed on that plain, the meaning the Irish Church has always taken from it is not in doubt. This was Christ against the old gods, in full public view, at the very heart of pagan power in Ireland, and Christ did not lose. Lochru did not survive the contest. Laughar, shaken, did not become a Christian himself that day. Some kings held out their whole lives, but he let Patrick preach unmolested from then on, and that was its own kind of victory, a door left standing open even by a man who would not walk through it. It is the tenderest of all these stories, though, that I think Patrick himself would have wanted remembered above the fire and the contests. The two daughters of Laughar, Ethne the fair and Fedlm the ruddy, who came upon Patrick and his clergy early one morning at a well near Cruachan, where the girls had gone, in the old way, to bathe. They found strangers in white robes sitting at the water's edge, and asked them, without fear, who they were and where they had come from, whether they were phantoms of the hills or gods themselves. Patrick told them, not gods, but servants of the one true God. And the girls, the tradition says, asked him with the plain, searching directness only the very young manage, where their God lived, whether he lived in the sky or the sea or the mountains, whether he had daughters and sons, whether he was young or old. Patrick answered them the way he answered every soul he ever won, not with cleverness, but with the whole faith laid out plainly, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the God who made all things and holds them still. The girls believed on the spot. They asked to see Christ's face, and Patrick told them no one sees that face and lives, not in this life. And, the story tells us, having received the Eucharist, both girls asked to go to him at once, and did not rise again from where they knelt. It is not a story of tragedy the way we might first hear it. It is a story of two young women so struck by what they had glimpsed of heaven that this world, suddenly, could not hold them. Whatever else it says about the mystery of grace working on hearts we cannot fully see into, it says this plainly. The daughters of the High King himself were not beyond Patrick's reach, and neither was anyone else in Ireland. He did not mean to stay the only priest in the country, and he knew he could not. From very early, Patrick set himself to raising up clergy from among the Irish themselves, not merely converting souls, but training shepherds who would outlast him, because the voice of the Irish had called him to walk among them, not to rule over them forever from Britain's shadow. Among the boys who joined him was one called Benignus, a chieftain's son who is said to have loved Patrick so dearly, even as a child, that he lay down at the saint's feet and would not be parted from him. And Benignus grew to be a bishop in his own right, sweet-voiced, a singer of psalms, and in time Patrick's own successor. He was not the only one. The Confessio itself tells us, in Patrick's own plain words, that he baptized many thousands of people with his own hands, and that he ordained clergy everywhere he went, sons and daughters of Irish kings, becoming monks and virgins of Christ, a whole native priesthood rising out of ground that 30 years before had known nothing of the gospel at all. This is no small thing to sit with. Patrick did not come to Ireland to build a monument to himself. He came to build a church that would not need him, that could stand, sing its psalms, break its bread, and raise its own bishops long after his bones were in the ground. That the Church of Ireland, within a few generations of his death, would send its own missionaries out across a broken Europe to relight the faith in lands that had lost it. That fact belongs to a later part of the story. But its roots are here. In every young Irish voice Patrick trained to sing the psalms in a tongue his own mother would never have understood. and churches went up, not cathedrals, not yet, but real buildings of wood and wattle and sometimes stone, raised wherever a chieftain gave land, and a community gathered, until the annalists, who kept count long after Patrick's death, spoke of hundreds of churches across the island, bearing some claim to his founding. Whatever the precise number, and no one now can say it to the last church exactly, the shape of the thing is beyond doubt. In one lifetime, in a country that had never seen a resident bishop, never held a font, never sung a Christian psalm within its own borders, a church took root deep enough that no persecution and no famine and no invader would ever fully root it out again. That is not a boast the historians make lightly. It is simply what happened. There came a point, though, when even a mission built on walking needed a home, a fixed seat, a mother church the rest could look to, the way a family looks to the house it was raised in, even after the children scatter. Patrick found that seat, in time, on a low hill in the north called Armagh, the height of Macha, and the way he came to it says as much about the man as any miracle. The land belonged to a chieftain named Dare, and when Patrick first asked for a plot on the hill to build a church, Dare refused him flatly, but sent, by way of some grudging courtesy, a fine bronze cauldron as a gift instead. Patrick's response, the old sources tell us, was simply to give thanks to God, Deo gratias, and nothing more. No complaint, no bargaining, no wounded pride. Word of that plain, unruffled gratitude reached Dare and struck him harder than any argument could have. A man who takes a slight and answers it with thanksgiving to God is a man whose faith you cannot easily dismiss. Dare relented, and more than relented, he gave Patrick the hill itself, the very height he had first refused, and it was there, around the middle of the century, that Patrick raised the church that would become the mother church of all Ireland. Armagh was never the grandest hill in the country, nor the richest, but it was the place Patrick chose to be the lasting home of everything he had built, the seat from which Irish bishops would govern an Irish church for 1,500 years and more, and it remains that seat to this day. Stand back far enough from all of it, the barn at Saul, the bleeding foot at Cashel, the fire on the plain of Tara, the 2 girls at the well who could not wait to see the face of Christ, the boy Benignus who would not leave his side, the hill at Armagh given over a cauldron refused, and you begin to see what the voice of the Irish had actually promised him on that hillside so many years before. Not comfort, not certainty that any single day would go as he hoped. Only this, that if he went and kept going, one soul and one kingdom at a time, a fire would catch that no cold wind off the Irish sea, and no king's displeasure would ever fully put out again. He had lit it, God helping him. He would spend the rest of his life discovering exactly what it cost to keep it burning. There is a night he never fully describes, and that is exactly why you can feel it. Somewhere in Ireland, we cannot say where, and Patrick himself does not tell us. A group of men had him bound, on his knees, with a blade near enough to his throat that he could feel the cold of it. He does not give us the chieftain's name. He does not tell us which tribe, which grievance, which drunken quarrel had turned a foreign bishop into the nearest thing to hand for someone's rage. What he tells us in the Confessio, written decades later when an old man could afford to be plain about such things, is only this: that it happened, that he expected to die, and that he did not. He says it happened not once, but many times. 12 times, by his own reckoning, his life hung by a single thread, bound in chains, robbed of everything he carried, threatened with death by men who had every means and every occasion to carry the threat out. Once he was held in irons for a fortnight, a prisoner among strangers, not knowing from one hour to the next whether he would see the sun go down. Once he says plainly that he was offered up in the intentions of the men holding him as material for slaughter. The phrase itself is stark, and he does not soften it. There were storms at sea that should have drowned him. There were ambushes that should have ended him on the road. He counts them the way a man counts scars, not for pity, but because the counting is itself the proof of something, that he ought, by every ordinary reckoning, to be dead many times over, and he is not, and the only explanation he can offer, the only one that ever satisfied him, is that God was not finished with him yet. You have to sit with that for a moment before you go further into this chapter, because it is easy, reading a saint's life at this distance, to forget that sanctity did not exempt him from terror. Patrick was afraid. Of course he was afraid. A man tells you plainly in his own writing that his life was threatened a dozen times, and you do not need him to spell out the fear. You have felt fear yourself on far smaller occasions, and you know what it does to the body, the mouth gone dry, the mind racing for an exit that is not there. He walked into that fear again and again, for 30 years and more, in a land with no legions to protect him, and no law that recognized his person, and he did not stop. That is not the absence of fear. That is fear carried and set down and picked back up the next morning, because the mission was bigger than the man carrying it. But if you asked him, and in a sense in the Confessio, he does answer this, though nobody put the question to him directly. Which wound cut deepest, I do not believe he would point you to any of those 12 nights. He would point you, I think, to a friend. We do not know this man's name. Patrick never gives it, out of what looks very much like mercy, a mercy the man himself had not extended in return. Before Patrick was ever ordained, back when he was young in the faith and still finding his feet on the strange new ground of the priesthood, he had confided in this friend a sin from his boyhood, something done before he was 15 years old, before the captivity, before any of it, the kind of thing every one of us carries from adolescence and hopes never to have spoken aloud. He trusted this man with it. He calls him, in the Confessio, his dearest friend, and he tells us that this same friend had once said to him, had said it to his face, that he would gladly have given up his own rank for Patrick's sake. So close was the bond between them. And then, years later, at a hearing before the elders, the kind of gathering where a bishop's fitness for office could be weighed and, if the wind turned against him, undone, this same friend stood up and spoke against him. He brought the old confidence into the open, the boyhood sin confessed in trust, and used it as a weapon in a room where Patrick's whole life's work was on trial. Patrick does not tell us exactly what was said, or exactly who else spoke, or how the matter was finally settled. What he tells us is the wound. He says he was deeply grieved. He says it more than once, in different words, circling back to it, the way a man circles back to an old bruise, checking whether it still hurts, finding that it does. I think this is one of the most tender passages in the whole Confessio, and I do not use that word lightly. A saint who could face an axe without flinching, or at least without turning back, could be undone by a friend's tongue in a room full of churchmen. There is no contradiction in that. Anyone who has been wounded by an enemy and then wounded again, far worse, by someone they loved and trusted, will recognize exactly what Patrick is describing. The blade in the wilderness threatens the body. The friend's betrayal threatens something else, the quiet conviction that you are known and safe in at least one corner of the world. Patrick lost that corner, and he tells us so, plainly, without excuse or self-pity, because the Confessio is not a document written to flatter its author. It is written to tell the truth before God, and the truth included this, that the mission cost him a friendship he had thought unbreakable, and he never got it back. He carried that loss, as he carried everything, into the work. And the work, in time, asked something else of him. Not patience with a wound already dealt, but fury at a wound freshly inflicted on people who could not defend themselves. The man's name was Caraticus. He was no pagan raider from beyond any frontier Patrick recognized. He was a British warlord, nominally Christian, ruling somewhere along the western coasts that Patrick himself had once called home in a different sense. And Caraticus's soldiers had done something that broke Patrick open in a way even his own near deaths had not. They had raided a company of Irish converts on the very day of their baptism. Men and women, still in the white garments, new Christians wore fresh from the water, the oil of confirmation not yet dry on their foreheads. And they had killed some of them outright and carried the rest off into slavery, to be sold, Patrick tells us, to the Picts and to apostates, to men who did not know Christ and would never let these new believers practice what they had just professed. Patrick's response to this is the Epistola, his letter to the soldiers of Caraticus, and if you have never read it, you should, because nowhere else in the surviving record do we hear this voice, not the humble, self-deprecating voice of the Confessio's opening pages, but something closer to a prophet's roar. He does not address Caraticus as a fellow Briton, a fellow Christian, a man who might listen to reason from one of his own. He strips that away entirely. He calls Caraticus and his soldiers fellow citizens of demons, not of the Romans he was born among, because of what they had done to Christ's newly born children. He says he cannot call them countrymen of his, not while their hands are stained with the blood of those still wearing their baptismal robes. He grieves in the letter for the ones who were slain, who he says were murdered while the chrism still gleamed bright on their foreheads, killed, in other words, in the very hour of their new birth, before they had even had time to live as Christians at all. He does more than grieve. He acts with every tool available to a bishop who had no legions and no king at his back. He excommunicates Caraticus and his men, cutting them off from the sacraments until they repent and return what they have stolen. He forbids the faithful to eat with them, to accept their hospitality, to treat their coin as clean, until amends are made for the baptized souls carried off into bondage among the heathen. He demands, in language that leaves no room for negotiation, that the enslaved be freed and the dead be mourned as martyrs, because that, in his eyes, is exactly what they were. Think for a moment about what this cost him. Caraticus was a Briton, a man of Patrick's own former world, ruling in territory close enough to touch the world Patrick had left behind at Banavem Taburnia. To denounce him this publicly, this absolutely, was to burn whatever bridges still connected Patrick to the comfort and respectability of home. It would have been so much easier, and Patrick surely knew this, being no fool about the ways of power, to write a private letter, a diplomatic word, something that might be quietly resolved between men of standing without embarrassing anyone. He chose instead to make it a matter of public record, to be read aloud, to be impossible to ignore. He chose the newly baptized Irish, people his own countrymen back in Britain would have considered barbarians beneath their notice, over any hope of favour with a fellow Briton who held real power. That is the choice underneath the choice, and it tells you something essential about what the gospel had done to this man. The people Rome would have called nobody had become, for Patrick, worth the whole weight of his authority and his reputation combined. And this brings us, by the straightest road, to the last cost this chapter has to tell. The poverty he did not merely endure, but chose. Patrick tells us, more than once and in more than one way, that he never took payment for baptizing anyone, not a single coin, not in all his years in Ireland. Kings offered him gifts, and in that world, a king's gift was not a small or a casual thing. To refuse it could be read as an insult, a slight against the giver's honour, the kind of refusal that made enemies among men who were used to having their generosity accepted as tribute to their power. Patrick refused anyway. Devout women would come forward and lay their ornaments, their bracelets and rings, on the altar as offerings, moved by what they had heard him preach, wanting to give something of value in return for what they had received. Patrick would not take those either. He gave them back, gently, we can imagine, but firmly, because he says outright that he was afraid of even the appearance that his preaching of the gospel might be for sale, that anyone ever might be able to say that Patrick of Ireland had grown rich off the faith of poor converts. This refusal cost him. He is honest about that too. Some of his own people, meaning fellow Christians, fellow clergy, men who might have expected him to accept the ordinary courtesies of his office, thought him strange for it, even foolish. There is a bruising honesty in the way he writes about this, almost defensive, as though he had been asked more than once to explain himself and had grown tired of explaining. He travelled at his own expense, among peoples who owed him nothing and from whom he took nothing, into regions where no bishop had ever gone before him, and where the ordinary rules of hospitality and payment simply did not apply to a man determined to remain, in every visible way, unbought. He tells us he did this so that nothing, no rumor, no accusation, no shadow of doubt could ever attach itself to the gospel through him. If people were to reject Christ, he wanted it to be Christ they rejected, not a foreign bishop suspected of lining his own pockets on the strength of a new religion. There is something almost fierce in this poverty, once you sit with it. It was not the passive poverty of a man who simply had nothing. Patrick had been offered plenty, again and again, by people with real wealth to give, and he turned it down every time, deliberately, at real cost to his own comfort and even to his standing among his peers. He chose to be poor the way he chose to confront Coroticus, not because it was easy, but because he had decided long before that the credibility of the gospel mattered more than his own reputation, his own comfort, even his own friendships. And that, I think, is the thread running under every part of this chapter. From the blade at his throat, to the friend's betrayal, to the fury against Coroticus, to the gifts he would not touch. None of it was accidental. None of it was simply what happened to a missionary in a hard country, the way weather happens to a traveller. Each cost was, in its way, a choice repeated, a man deciding, over and over, across 30 years, that the mission was worth more than his safety, worth more than his oldest friendship, worth more than the goodwill of powerful men, worth more than the comfort a bishop of his standing could easily have claimed. He does not ask us, in the Confessio, to admire him for this. He asks us, if anything, to notice how little of it was his own doing, how the strength to keep choosing this way came from somewhere outside himself, sustaining a man who by his own account was never anything more than a sinner rescued once, and then rescued again, and again, 12 times and more, for a purpose he had not chosen and could no longer set down. He paid, in other words, exactly what love costs when love refuses to be careful. And having paid it near the end of his life, he sat down to tell us so. Not as a boast, but as a debt of honesty owed to the God who had asked so much of him, and had, every single time, been there to catch him, when the thread finally seemed about to break. On the last Sunday of July, before the sun has properly cleared the shoulder of the mountain, they are already climbing. Thousands of them, in the dark and the mist, up loose scree that turns an ankle if you're not careful. Some of them in boots, some of them the ones who came to do it properly, barefoot on stone that has cut pilgrim feet for 1500 years. Croagh Patrick rises over Clew Bay in County Mayo, a cone of quartzite you can see from half the county, and on Reek Sunday it belongs, for one morning, entirely to him. Nobody built a shrine at the top grand enough to explain the crowd. There is a small chapel, a statue, a place to hear Mass in whatever wind is blowing. That is all. The mountain itself is the monument, and the reason people climb it is simple and old. He prayed and fasted on that summit once, alone, wrestling with God on behalf of a people not yet fully his own, and the ground has never quite let go of what happened there. You do not climb Croagh Patrick to look at something. You climb it because he did, and because something in the climbing still answers something in you. That is the strange fact at the centre of this chapter, and it is worth sitting with before we go any further. Patrick died. We will come to how and when, in due course, and by every ordinary rule of history that should have been that. A missionary bishop in a poor, remote corner of the Western world. No great sea behind him. No army, no printing press, no institution powerful enough to guarantee his memory would survive the century. Plenty of men, holier than kings, have vanished from memory entirely. Patrick did not vanish. 16 centuries on, people still climb a mountain for him before dawn. They still fast 3 days on an island in a lake for him. They still pin a green weed to their coats every march, and mean something by it they could not fully explain if you asked them. They still open a small Latin book written by an old man defending his own good name, and hear in it not an artifact but a voice, a man talking urgently about his own sins and God's mercy, as if the conversation were still going on. That is the whole point of this chapter. The fire did not go out, it could not be put out. And the reason is not that Patrick built something clever enough to last. It is that what he lit was never his to control in the first place. Start with the book, because the book is where his own voice still speaks, plainly, without a translator standing between you and him. The Confessio is not a biography, and was never meant to be one. Patrick wrote it near the end of his life, an old man answering accusers who doubted his fitness, maybe his honesty, maybe his right to have gone to Ireland at all. He does not open it with a boast. He opens it as a man laying his cards on the table before God and everyone. I am Patrick, a sinner, the most unsophisticated of men, the least of all the faithful, and to many the most contemptible. Read that sentence aloud sometime and notice what it does not sound like. It does not sound like a saint's legend polishing its own hero. It sounds like a man who has nothing left to prove and no more patience for pretending otherwise. That voice, unguarded, plain, sometimes clumsy in its Latin because Latin was never quite his mother tongue after 6 years of shepherding sheep instead of studying grammar, has never stopped being read. It is read in seminaries in Rome and in Maynooth. It is read by mothers at kitchen tables in Cork and in Lagos. It is read, quietly, by people going through their own captivity of one kind or another. Addiction, grief, exile, the slow grinding loneliness that has no dramatic name, who find in an old shepherd's testimony of despair and rescue something that speaks straight past the centuries to their own condition. He was not trying to write scripture. He was trying to tell the truth about what God had done for a man who deserved none of it. That is exactly why it has outlived every clever thing anyone else wrote about him. Then there is the prayer, and if the Confessio is his voice speaking quietly, the Lorica is his faith set to fire. Tradition calls it St. Patrick's breastplate, sometimes the deer's cry, formerly the Lorica Patriciae, the word Lorica meaning the armour a Roman soldier wore into battle, the very same word Patrick would have known from his father's world in Banavem-Tabernier, where soldiers and officials and the machinery of empire were the ordinary furniture of a comfortable boyhood he never asked for and later gave up entirely. Scholars who study the language date the Lorica as we have it to the 8th century, several hundred years after Patrick's own lifetime, and that is worth knowing honestly rather than glossing over. But knowing that changes nothing about what the prayer is. It did not fall from nowhere. It rose up out of the patrician tradition itself, out of monks and communities who had lived so long inside the fire he lit that when they needed words strong enough to hold back the dark, his name was the one they reached for, because everyone already knew what kind of faith that name stood for. The prayer they gave us in his voice binds the one praying it to Christ entirely. Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in the heart of every man who thinks of me, Christ in the eye that sees me, Christ in the ear that hears me. An armour made of nothing but relationship. No steel in it at all, only presence. Soldiers have prayed it going into battle, the dying have prayed it. Cecil Francis Alexander set an English version of it to hymn tune in the 19th century. I bind unto myself today. And it is sung now in cathedrals and country parishes on his feast day by congregations who may never open the Confessio in their whole lives, but who stand and sing his armour unto themselves anyway, without quite knowing they are doing what Irish monks did 1200 years ago in his name. A prayer that has been prayed continuously by frightened people for that long is not a museum piece. It is a weapon still being carried. The shamrock is the smallest of these things, and maybe, for that reason, the most loved. A 3-leafed clover, the kind that grows wild in every field in Ireland, the kind a poor teacher with no books and no university behind him could bend down and pick up off the road to explain something no human language handles well. 3 persons, 1 God, undivided. Nobody needed Latin for that lesson. Nobody needed to have read a line of theology. You could be a farmer's son standing in a wet field in Meath in the 5th century, watching a foreign bishop hold up a common weed and understand something true about the nature of God that the finest minds in Alexandria were still arguing over in council chambers at the very same time. That is the whole genius of the man laid bare in one small green leaf. He never made the faith smaller to fit his listeners, but he never made it needlessly harder either. He found what was already lying on the ground and used it to open a door. Now the whole world wears it. Chicago dyes its river green. Sydney lights its opera house shells in it. Buenos Aires and Boston and Melbourne fill their streets with it every March. Most of the crowd having not the faintest memory of a Trinity lesson in a wet field, wearing it now simply because it means Irish, means belonging, means home even to people 3 and 4 generations removed from anywhere Irish soil ever touched their feet. He would likely be embarrassed by the parades. But the leaf itself, worn in true devotion by the ones who still know what it was for, remains exactly what it always was. The simplest catechism ever taught, still being taught, still working. If Croagh Patrick is where pilgrims go to climb toward him, Lough Derg is where they go to be scoured by him. Station Island, a small rocky outcrop in a lake in County Donegal, has been a place of penance associated with his name for so long that its very informal title, St. Patrick's Purgatory, assumes everyone already knows the story without needing it explained. Pilgrims arrive and take off their shoes and do not put them back on for 3 days. They fast on black tea and dry toast. They walk barefoot again and again around stone circles called penitential beds, praying as they go, kneeling on rock worn smooth by centuries of other bare knees. They stay awake through an entire night, the vigil, because sleep is a mercy penance does not grant easily. It sounds harsh described plainly like that, and it is meant to be felt as harsh. That is not incidental to what it does. People do not go to Lough Derg for comfort. They go because somewhere in them is a debt they want to pay honestly, a sin they cannot fully absolve themselves of by simply feeling sorry, a grief that words alone will not touch. And they go, still in his name, because Patrick himself never asked God for an easy road, and was never given one. He fasted 40 days on a mountain for a people who had not even asked him to. He wrote near the end of his life that he was ready to be murdered, betrayed, enslaved again, whatever it cost, provided the gospel he carried reached the people he had been given. A faith that costly does not produce comfortable pilgrimages. It produces Lough Derg, and it keeps producing pilgrims every single year, because the human soul, whatever century it happens to be born into, still recognizes real penance when it finds it, and still hungers for it more than it hungers for comfort. None of this stayed in Ireland, and that is perhaps the most remarkable turn of all. Patrick's mission was to one island, one people, in his own lifetime. The voice that called him, after all, was the voice of the Irish specifically, not the voice of the world. But grace has never been very good at staying inside the borders it has handed. Irish priests and religious sisters, over the centuries, and especially in the 19th and 20th, carried his name with them wherever the ships of empire, poverty, and famine scattered their own people, and wherever they carried the gospel besides. Devotion to Patrick took root in places he never walked and never could have imagined. Across Africa, and nowhere more vividly than in Nigeria, where his feast is kept today with a fervour that would not embarrass Downpatrick itself. Parishes named for him filled past their doors, choirs singing his hymn in languages he never heard a word of. It is one of the quiet miracles of the whole story that a British boy taken as a slave to a pagan island became, 16 centuries later, a patron whose feast is kept with equal joy in Lagos and in Boston, in Sydney and in Buenos Aires, wherever Irish emigration or Irish missionary zeal happened to plant him. He belongs now to more than the island that once enslaved him and later called him home. He belongs, in a real and living way, to everyone who has ever been carried somewhere they did not choose and found God waiting there anyway. And that, in the end, is why the diaspora loves him the way it does. Not merely as a badge of heritage, though it is certainly worn as one, but as a patron who understands exactly what it costs to belong to 2 homes at once and be fully at peace in neither. Every Irish emigrant who ever stood on a departure dock in Cove or Donaghare, watching a green coastline shrink into fog, carried inside them a version of the very split Patrick lived his whole life long. He was British by birth and blood, shaped by a Roman world of villas and town councils and a father who sat on one. He became, by grace and by love, thoroughly Irish, buried in Irish soil, remembered in Irish prayer, claimed by Ireland as her own so completely that most people meeting his name for the first time assume he was born there. He never stopped being both. He never had to choose in the end which home was real, because both were real. And the God who called him back across the sea did not ask him to disown the country of his birth in order to love the country of his mission. That is exactly the wound and the gift of every emigrant who has ever left one country and made a life and a family in another. Loving both, belonging fully to neither, homesick in both directions at once. Patrick is their patron not by accident of geography, but because he lived precisely that condition all the way through, and came out the other side of it not embittered but grateful, writing near the end of his days that he wished only to spend and be spent for the people God had given him, whichever shore they happened to stand on. Stand then at the bottom of Croagh Patrick before dawn on the last Sunday of July, among the thousands waiting for enough light to climb by. Or stand on the shore of Lough Derg watching pilgrims take off their shoes. Or simply sit some quiet evening with an old Latin book translated into your own tongue, reading a sentence written by a frightened old man defending his life's work to people who doubted him. In every one of those places, something is still burning that a 5th century bishop lit and then, by every honest measure, lost control of entirely. He could not have organised this. He did not live to see a single stone of Croagh Patrick's chapel laid, did not know his letter would become scripture adjacent to millions, did not know a common weed would end up dyed into rivers on the far side of an ocean he never crossed. He only knew and said plainly that the mission was never his in the first place, that he was a debtor to God for all of it, unable to repay even a fraction of the mercy he had been shown, and glad, entirely glad, to spend the rest of himself trying anyway. That is the fire. It was never his to put out, because he never lit it for his own glory to begin with. He only carried it as far as his own strength would go, and then handed it, without meaning to everyone who has picked it up since. The fire is still burning. That is the first thing to say, and perhaps the only thing that matters before we close this book. On a hillside above the Boyne, on a night the old stories fix at Easter, a young bishop with a British accent and an Irish heart lit a flame that a high king's druids had forbidden. And it did not go out. It did not go out at Tara. It did not go out through 15 centuries of storm and famine and exile. It has not gone out in you, reading these pages, I'd wager that much, since you have come this far with him. You have walked with him now from a comfortable house in Roman Britain to a hillside of sheep in a strange country, from the ship that would not take him to the ship that finally did, from the dream of children calling his name to the long grey work of building a church one soul, one chieftain's hall, one river crossing at a time. You have seen what it cost him, the accusation from the elders he trusted, the constant danger, the loneliness of a man who gave up going home. And you have heard, or begun to hear, the prayer that outlived him, the lorica rising like his own breath drawn in against the dark. Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ in me. That is a portrait. I hope it is a true one, and a warm one, because Patrick deserves both. But a portrait, however faithfully drawn, is a window and not the house itself. You have seen the man's shape against the light. What you have not yet had, not fully, not at the depth his own confessio invites, is the chance to sit with him the way you would sit with someone you have decided to love rather than merely admire. That is what the 3 volumes are for. I want to tell you honestly what each one holds, because I think you are ready for them now, and because nothing would please Patrick less than a reader who stopped at admiration when he was asking the whole of his life to be known. Consider what it would mean to sit with the boy of Banavem Tabernier for longer than a chapter can hold, to walk with him from the comfortable house of Calpurnius the deacon down to the slave ships, and further, into the 6 years on that hillside in Ireland where a careless boy became a praying man. That is the ground of The Voice of the Irish, the first volume, and it is the one I'd send you to first, because it is the one that answers the question every honest reader eventually asks about a saint. Was he always like this? The answer, and it is Patrick's own answer in his own Latin, is no. He tells us himself in the Confessio that he did not know the true God as a boy, that his father's faith had not become his own, that he was carried off to Ireland deservedly, in his own severe word, because he and his people had turned away. The Voice of the Irish does not soften that confession the way a shorter telling might have to, for want of room. It gives you the whole weight of it, the family he came from, what we can know and what remains honestly uncertain about where Banavem Tabernier actually stood, whether in Wales or Cumbria or further south, and why that uncertainty does not diminish the story, but roots it more firmly in a real, dated, breathing world. It gives you the 6 years in full, the cold, the hunger, the prayers rising 100 times a day and 100 times a night, until, as he tells us, the love of God and fear of him increased more and more, and faith grew, and the spirit was moved. You will meet the voice that told him in a dream that his ship was ready, and you will walk the 200 miles to the coast with him, not knowing the ending, the way he did not know it. And you will hear at last in full the dream that gives the volume its name, the man named Victoricus, the letters headed The Voice of the Irish, the plea that undid a comfortable life for good. We appeal to you, holy servant boy, come and walk among us once more. I think of that volume as the one that gives you Patrick's interior, the making of the instrument, before you ever hear the mission he was made for. If chapter 5 of this small book was a doorway, The Voice of the Irish is the room behind it, fully furnished, and you will not want to rush through it. Then there is the mission itself. Not the outline of it, you have that now, but the texture, the danger, the sheer improbability of what a formerly enslaved man attempted when he went back to the country that had broken him. That is I Live Among Barbarians, and the title is Patrick's own phrase, lifted straight from the Confessio, where he describes himself living among barbarous tribes for the sake of the gospel of Christ. It is not a phrase of contempt. He uses it the way a soldier might describe a hard posting he chose freely and would not trade, matter of fact, a little wry, entirely without complaint. This second volume takes you into the Ireland he actually worked in, the kings whose favour he needed and sometimes could not win, the druids whose authority he challenged simply by baptizing without asking permission, the language he had to learn in a country with no written tongue of its own before he came, the slow negotiation of every river crossing and every night's lodging in a land with no roads built for a bishop's business. It is the volume of risk, of the real danger Patrick names in his own writing, the times he was seized, the times he was nearly killed, the gifts he refused from kings, precisely so that no one could later say he had come to Ireland for gain. And it is the volume that gives full weight to the letter he never meant for us, but which the Church has kept regardless. The Epistola, his letter to the soldiers of Carodicus, written in a fury that has not cooled in 16 centuries. You have heard, in this short book, what that letter cost him and what it defended. The dignity of newly baptized Irish converts, murdered or dragged into slavery by a Christian warlord's raiders on the very day of their confirmation, their white baptismal garments still gleaming, in Patrick's own bitter phrase, when the blood was shed on them. I Live Among Barbarians will not let you look away from that letter the way a shorter book must, of necessity, let you glance at it and move on. It sits you down with Patrick's rage and lets you see that his rage was love wearing armour. The same love that baptized thousands, ordained priests, planted churches, and built at Armagh, the seat from which all that scattered work could finally hold together and outlast him. That is the volume for the reader who wants to know what apostleship actually cost in daily coin. Not the cost in a single chapter's worth of grief, which is what this book could give you, but the cost counted year on year, journey on journey, refusal on refusal, until you understand why he could write, near the end of his life, that he was ready to be murdered, betrayed, enslaved, whatever may befall me. And mean it not as a figure of speech, but as a man who had already tallied the bill and signed for it. And then, last, there is what remains after a man like that dies. That is I Arise Today, and its title is the first line of the Lorica, the prayer we sat with in the chapter before this one, the prayer that rises through Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me. Into a shield against a darkness Patrick had spent his whole life walking through. The Lorica is not, strictly, proven word for word from his own hand. The language of the prayer as we have it belongs to a somewhat later century of Irish devotion. But the tradition has always known what it is doing in placing those words in his mouth. It is the pulse of the man distilled, the Trinity invoked not as doctrine to be defended, but as breath to be drawn, protection sought not from a distant God, but from Christ pressed so close he is beside, before, behind, beneath, above, within. I Arise Today opens that prayer out fully. Where it comes from, what it asks, why generations of Irish men and women have said it over sickbeds and coffins and the doors of houses at nightfall. And alongside it, the volume gives you the fuller shape of what came after Patrick's own death. How Armagh grew from the sea he founded into the primatial heart of the Irish Church. How the small, scattered communities he had planted became, in the centuries that followed, the great monasteries of what history would come to call the island of saints and scholars, sending missionaries back out across a Europe gone dark, carrying the very fire lit that Easter night on the hill of Slane into places Patrick himself never walked. It is the volume of harvest, of a man's death not as an ending, but as a planting, and of a country that took an escaped slave's gospel and made of it something the whole of Christendom would come, eventually, to lean on. I have given each volume its own weight because each one truly earns it, and because I would be doing you a disservice, and Patrick a worse one, if I pretended one small book could hold what 3 large ones were written to hold. But I want to say something else, too, plainly, before you decide whether to go further. None of the 3 volumes will ask you to leave your faith at the door. That was never the point of any of them, and it is certainly not the point of this one. Patrick is not a figure to be studied the way you might study a stone circle or a battle map, admired from a safe historical distance and then set back on the shelf. He asked, in the last line of his own testimony, that whoever read his Confessio would never say that his ignorance had accomplished anything of value, that whatever good had come of his life should be understood by everyone who came after him to be the working of God's grace and nothing else. That is not a historian's disclaimer, that is a dying man's plea to be believed. The 3 volumes take that plea seriously in the same way this small book has tried to. They do not stand outside the faith and describe it. They stand inside it, the way Patrick stood inside it, and they ask you to stand there too. Not because the facts require it, but because the man himself would have found any other way of reading him a kind of theft. If you want to know the boy before he was a saint, the frightened, cold, half-formed young man on a hillside who did not yet know what was being made of him, go first to the voice of the Irish. If you want to know the cost of the mission in full, the danger, the fury at injustice, the refusals, the founding of Armagh, the letter he wrote in grief that has outlasted the man who angered him, go to I Live Among Barbarians. And if you want to sit with what he left behind, the prayer that still rises from Irish tongues at nightfall, and the country of saints and scholars, his single life set in motion, let I Arise Today carry you there. You do not have to read them in that order, and you do not have to read them at all to have met him truly here. This small book was never meant to be a summary you could set aside, satisfied. It was meant to be an introduction in the oldest sense, the kind where you are brought into a room and given a hand to shake, and then left to decide for yourself whether you want to know this person for the rest of your life. I think you do. I think that is why you read this far. So let me leave you the way the parish priests of my childhood used to leave a congregation on the 17th of March, after the fire and the green and the noise of the day had settled, not with an argument, not with a sales pitch dressed as devotion, but with a blessing. Because that is what Patrick himself would once said over you before you go any further into his story, or close this book and simply carry him in your heart. May Christ be with you, and Christ before you, Christ behind you, and Christ within you, Christ beneath you, and Christ above you. Christ on your right, and Christ on your left, the way the old prayer says it. The way a frightened, faithful man once said it, walking through a country that was not yet his own, until it became, by grace and by love, and by the plain hard labour of 40 years, entirely his own, and entirely God's. Go rive math agat, Padraig. Thank you, Patrick, for the boy you were, for the slave you became, for the voice you heard on a hillside, for the fire you lit that no darkness has yet put out. Walk with us a while longer, if you will. We are glad, all these centuries later, to have been called.